Thank you, Riley. Good morning. My name is Marty Groman. I have the honor and pleasure of serving as Executive Director of E2 Tech. Thank you for joining our webinar this morning, Achieving Regional Policy, Achieving Policy Goals. And we've got an incredible panel, so I get to provide a little intro here before handing things off to our moderator, Sarah Tracy. So E2 Tech, you know us, we've been growing. And we're 335 member companies, including a few great startups from the Rue Institute recently, which has been fun. People joke that I'm kind of networker in chief. Just this week, I connected actually one of those startups, which is called Esquad, that makes a remote monitoring system to an E2 Tech member to do some wetlands delineation, and a really cool thing to be able to do. And that's what we're about. We make our events free for students and elected public officials. So the support of our sponsors and sustaining partners makes that possible. We've been doing this for 20 plus years, and we provide these kinds of roundtables. We advocate for clean tech and environmental and energy sustainability overall, but never on behalf of a certain bill or something like that. And watch for the Clean Tech Open connection in March. We're really excited to get more Maine startups into Clean Tech Open. Been working hard to increase the diversity of our field. A lot of thanks goes to our longtime board member, David Ertz, who's been volunteering with Diversity Recruiter Intwork every week, helping them out. And we've just placed a couple of geologists, new Mainers with E2 Tech members, CV Mahar. So it's really nice to see that outcome. I mentioned MTI, the Maine Technology Institute. This is a remarkable institution that we have here. Learn more about them at mainetechnology.org. But I just looked actually, 10 awards made in the environmental sector in the last year to leading startups in everything from biofuels to new wood technologies to PFAS remediation. You've got one of those ideas and you've got a large company, great, let's start there. If you have an idea for a startup and you're going to get going and want to do a market study, let's do that. MTI can help with either of those things. All of our work year round is supported by our sustaining leaders. Thanks so much to them, Bernstein Schur, Con Addison, SMRT Architects and Engineers, TRC, and Central Maine Power, and another plug for MTI there. These companies believe in what we do and get behind it. And I always like to linger on this slide a little bit. We're so thankful to all of these companies, the sustaining leader or $1,000 level. They make what we do possible all year round. We kind of call this our shield. And so please patronize these companies. And if I can help with a connection at any of them, I'm happy to do that as we all work to advance the sector. Speaking of sectors, we just did a board retreat and exercise, and we tried to capture some of the things that our members do. This is by no means all encompassing, but just to give you an idea of all of the types of work that our members are involved in. And of course, our forum topics bounce around from one to the next, but you can expect to see things in this general arena. And our forums are suggested by our members and developed by our members, not by me. Riley and I just help deliver them. So when you have that idea of something we should give a talk about, get involved. And hard-hitting forum coming up here, people. This one is going to be on the nose, controversial, a big holiday party. So I hope you get involved with this. We have an exciting new board member that we will elect here, but the remarks will be short and the networking will be fruitful, I'm sure. So please come see us at Wednesday, December 14th at Revision Energy. And we have set the date for our legislative preview, Thursday, February 2nd, 2023. Let's hope there's not a snowstorm. So generally, we ask for the indulgence of the chairs of the energy and environmental committees to talk through what they see for the upcoming session. And then we'll have a visit to the State House after that. So save the date. The registration isn't live for that yet, but save the date. In a second, you're going to hear about this next forum, and then just another plug here in the purple box. We're always looking for your ideas, including for like a 1-hour talk at lunch under series we call E2 Tech Connects. So today's gold sponsor is Long Road Energy. We're extremely thankful to Long Road. I think Matt Kearns is in the audience, as well as Chad Allen. Long Road is been making a number of high impact announcements here in Maine with excellent work going on in Maine and through the region. Thanks for all they do. But our platinum sponsor is Central Maine Power, and we're pleased to have Lainey Brown, who's Director of Sustainability of On-Grid and Central Maine Power here. And Lainey, could you talk to us a little bit about why this work in this sector and this regional collaboration is so important to you and the team?
Absolutely, and thank you, Marty, and good morning, everyone. Central Maine Power Company is proud to be a sponsor of today's forum, and it's such a relevant topic for us. We know Maine's climate action plan is critically important because it recognizes the threat of climate change and presents solutions. At CMP, we believe we have an essential role in the fight against climate change. It's part of our governance policy, and we're prioritizing actions to reduce emissions, enable clean energy transition, and to minimize our environmental impact. Our role is unique in that we must physically enable new sources of energy to come onto the grid while ensuring service and safety. And it requires a more dynamic grid, and it's our job to enable that transition. While climate change represents an unprecedented challenge, we also see it as an opportunity for creating a more sustainable, equitable energy system. This transition is key in reducing carbon emissions while also ensuring we provide safe, reliable, and affordable electricity. We want to serve as a catalyst to advance Maine's clean energy policy. Our commitment to addressing the climate change is reflected in our goals to achieve scopes 1 and 2 carbon neutrality by 2030. And we're trying to work on it just as obviously we're all working on the clean energy plan. And we also want to provide opportunities for others to reduce their emissions, including CMP's new rates to support more economical heat pump use. We appreciate the opportunity to be here today and look forward to learning more about the continued planning and actions to address climate change. So many thanks.
Thank you, Lainey. Well said. And thanks for the commitment that your company is showing. And thanks. I'm reliably told that you're traveling in Denver. So I know that you got up at 4:30 and it's 6 a.m.
Very happy. So we have virtual. So I could be here.
So thank you. So we also have just a couple of quick things about, so this is a Zoom webinar. Everybody knows that at this point. We will use the Q&A panel. I encourage you, and our moderator, Sarah Tracy, will encourage you, I'm sure, to use the Q&A panel. You can start putting the questions in now. Please do not hesitate. So it is time for me to leave the stage, which is always a good moment. Somebody said, does Sarah moderate all of your panels? But she's the best. That's all there is to it. So you can see Sarah's bio there, but we're going to turn it over to Sarah to run the program from here. Sarah, thank you for doing this, and let's kick things off.
All right, thanks, Marty. So my name is Sarah Tracy. I'm a partner at Pierce Atwood and co-chair of the Energy and Energy Infrastructure Group there, but I also have a pretty active role at E2 Tech. I'm just the recent past co-chair of the program committee and have been working on this forum for a while. So the concept for this forum, I'll just talk briefly about, and then we'll talk to you about our next forum. So, because this is sort of part of a series. The concept of this forum is recognizing that Maine has ambitious climate policy goals and greenhouse gas reduction goals. We obviously need to make strides in that area, but there are states in New England that are obviously a little bit before us in time. They are doing the same energy transition. And so we thought that it might be helpful to learn a little bit about what these New England states are doing. So the concept for this forum is to learn from other jurisdictions. Fortunately, we have Hannah Pingree here to tell us a little bit about updates on what Maine is doing, and then ultimately we will have a Maine-based forum. But I do want to talk to you before we get there about our next forum, just so that you know what's coming and you know what the context is. And here to do that is Shelby Wright. Shelby is Eastern Regional Manager of Engagement at Casella Waste, and she is on the program committee as well with us, and she'll talk to you about what's coming up next, so you can kind of think about how they all relate together.
Good morning, Sarah and Marty and everyone. Hello. As we said, we are doing a series of discussions on the clean energy transition. The first of all today is going to be discussing, things that are going on in our region and neighboring states. And then our next one, which is we are working on currently, the working title will be Aspirational Environmental Infrastructure. And as Sarah also mentioned, Maine has ambitious climate policy goals and greenhouse gas reduction targets, but what will it take for Maine's existing infrastructure to meet the demands of a clean energy transition? And so we are working currently on putting together a fireside chat style forum to really look at Maine's own industry and invite our industry leaders to come in and discuss how the private sector is tackling this challenge of meeting these ambitious goals. We'll discuss, where are we now with the state of our infrastructure currently, what action items might be underway in different industries that are reaching across the state to tackle these climate goals, and what barriers and opportunities exist for industry to adapt to our climate goals. We'd love for you to join us. We have tentatively scheduled this for the end of February in 2023. And as we plan this forum, again, tentatively titled Aspirational Environmental Infrastructure, we invite all of you today to get involved. Any E2 Tech member can contribute to the programming process, and we would welcome any feedback and suggestions or ideas for speakers to participate in our next forum. So thank you very much, and I hope you'll consider joining us in February, not only for the forum, but also helping with the programming of said forum. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, Shelby. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Hannah Pingree. I will do panelist introductions after Hannah speaks, but Hannah has graciously volunteered to come and speak with us about what's going on in Maine. And so Hannah Pingree, many of you know her. She's the director of the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future, which is affectionately called GOPIF. And so GOPIF is the key coordinator on multiple critical long-term issues facing Maine, but one of them is climate change policy, greenhouse gas reductions. And so Hannah co-chaired is co-chairing the Maine Climate Council and was integral to the December 2020 Maine Won't Wait 4-year climate action plan. And so Hannah is here, and we've also had ongoing activities around that, including energy justice, evaluations and progress report on December 1st on 2021, and more to come. So Hannah's here today to give us a little bit of an update on what Maine is doing, and then we'll after Hannah speaks, I'll introduce the panelists, and we'll talk a little bit more about what the larger region is doing. So Hannah, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Marty. And it is excellent to be here with colleagues from other Northeastern states who are doing incredibly good work. I'm going to just share my screen a little bit. And to the hardcore climate folks, I know you've seen some of these slides many times before. So we really just can't help but continue to brag about Maine's progress, and Marty encouraged me to do this. So thank you, Marty. So I'm just going to quickly just remind you of the context of Maine's climate plan as you think about what is happening in other states. I think many of you understand and recall that Maine has a 4-year climate action plan. It was completed December 2020. So we are now just coming up on the 2-year anniversary of that climate plan. I'm very pleased that I'm still in this job and will be starting in January. So my boss was just reelected. I know other folks on this Zoom call are in a similar position. So looking forward to another 4 years of working to implement this plan. I will just say, I'm not going to go into deep detail, and I know that this is sort of the context of the call. I mean, we are right now this morning, reading the newspaper, looking at just absolutely crushing energy bills for people in our region and even across our country and around the world. Mainers are facing obviously increased electricity rates. We just saw the standard offer rates come out for most people in the state of Maine and seeing 40 and 50% increases in energy prices. The price of kerosene, which Dan Burgess, is sort of alarmingly aware of, is over $7 a gallon. Heating oil prices are over $5, some places as high as $6. So we are in the middle of doing incredibly important climate work, but also facing a state that is incredibly reliant on fossil fuels for our electricity sector. Natural gas obviously driving the prices of energy, electricity we're seeing in the state of Maine. We are the most reliant state in the country on heating fuels. More than 60% of Mainers heat their home with fossil fuels, heating oil and kerosene. That is a vast outlier for the country. So we are doing this work in the context of both the importance of doing it for the sake of our climate and our planet, but also because Mainers are facing energy burdens because of our reliance on fossil fuels that are really increasingly untenable. So I will just say it is our governor, my boss, is trying to marshal all of the forces possible to help those who can least afford to heat their homes this winter. We're painfully aware of just how difficult the challenges are, looking forward to hopefully urgent legislative action to help people get through this winter. But I think it also just really highlights the need for focusing on our energy transition. I am super proud of the progress that we've made since we enacted this plan. But I will just say that the whole point of this call is our neighbors across the region are doing really good work, and our work in Maine really needs to build on what's happening regionally. A lot of this, we're all part of a regional electricity grid. We work together on a variety of initiatives, whether it's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or the U.S. Climate Alliance, which I think almost all the states in New England, except for New Hampshire, are a part of. So lots of bipartisan action happening across the region already. So I'm just going to do a quick couple reminders. I think everyone understands that we passed a law in 2019 to start the Maine Climate Council, put our emission reduction requirements into law. I like to just always remind people that our law was overwhelmingly passed with support of people in both political parties, actually sponsored by Republican Senator David Woodson. And I think that really is the basis of Maine's climate action. We hope that it is not a partisan issue. It is an issue that impacts every Mainer. And as we make this transition, the opportunities and jobs that can come from climate transition are also hopefully going to be equally felt across political parties and across our state. So just a reminder, our Maine's climate goals are similar to much of our region. So we have to produce a climate action plan every 4 years. We're halfway through our first plan in many years. The state has now passed a law that we need to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. Most of the region has a carbon neutrality goal by at least 2050. Maine's greenhouse gas reduction targets 45% by 2030 and at least 80% by 2050. And obviously lots of work happening to prepare our state, our industries, and our people for the impacts of climate, which I will say we are increasingly seeing the impacts in our communities, on our infrastructure, extreme heat events, rain events, and I know I don't need to tell anybody that this is happening. I will just say that Maine right now, we have our most recent greenhouse gas reduction report. It takes a couple years, it's from 2019, and Maine is at a 25% reduction from 1990 levels. So between 1990 and 2019, we reduced our emissions 25%. We are moving in the right direction, which is good news. Not every state in the country can brag about that. We still have, though, another 20% to go in the next 7 years. So huge need to marshal clean energy resources, electrify our economy, reduce our emissions in order to achieve the results we need. So just a reminder, that most recent report gave us new numbers about where Maine's emissions come from, not that dissimilar from the rest of the region. I will say the emissions have changed slightly, so a little under 50% from transportation, still Maine's most significant challenge when it comes to emissions. We are a state, very large rural population, people driving long distances for work. So the need to both electrify our transportation where possible, focus on public transportation, broadband, lots of opportunities here, but also big challenges for our state. Over 30% of the state's emissions come from our buildings. That's why we've had a huge focus on our building sector. I will say we are very proud to be, I think, leading the country in heat pump deployment. So over 80,000 heat pumps deployed since 2019. We are well ahead of the governor's goal to deploy 100,000 heat pumps by 2025. So we're already trying to revise that goal and figure out how we can be even more ambitious. And then the last emissions are really coming from our industrial and our electricity sector. Obviously, the 5% electricity sector emissions really signal, how much progress has been made by the region. But obviously, our load will grow, and the need to deploy more clean energy resources to meet our goals is going to be essential. So again, we have a climate council comprised of lots of people around the state. They have worked hard over multiple years. They are still meeting. I will just highlight right now, we have the equity subcommittee, which is working to make sure that Maine's climate plan is being implemented equitably. And I will just say, when we think about the energy burden that Maine people are facing, especially this winter, the need to ensure that the resources we are deploying are benefiting those disadvantaged communities, those people who are most challenged by energy costs, that is really top of our mind right now. So again, Maine's got 4 big goals for our climate plan, obviously to reduce our emission, to make our state more resilient to the impacts of climate change, foster economic opportunity and prosperity. And I will just say, Marty, you talked about Long Road, huge announcements coming out on a regular basis about good news about clean energy deployment around our state that's creating jobs, creating clean energy at a lower cost from as compared to natural gas and other fossil emissions. So we're seeing huge opportunity, but obviously still a lot of work to make it happen. And again, I mentioned equity. Equity is really essential to our goals. So I won't go through in the gruesome details, but I will say that Maine's climate plan has sort of 8 key areas. The first 3 are about reducing our emissions. Reducing our emissions in the energy sector are probably kind of the big point of this call and what all the states are working on jointly together. Maine has a goal to make sure that 80% of our emissions, 80% of our electricity on the grid is renewable by 2030. We're at 45% right now, so still a lot that needs to be done in the coming 7 years. We have obviously exciting projects that we hope happen with a huge opportunity in northern Maine that's currently being engaged by our PUC. We're working with neighbors in Massachusetts to make that happen. But obviously, huge focus on energy to ensure that electrified transportation, electrified heating is possible. So I will just, the last couple of things I'll say are Maine has a very aggressive goal to double the number of clean energy jobs by 2030. We see in Maine, we don't produce a lot of fossil fuels, so the ability to deploy renewable resources is really just a win for our state because thousands more jobs will be created. We will stop exporting the $4 to $5 billion a year to other parts of the country and other parts of the world to buy fossil fuels. So the governor is squarely focused on this goal, especially at a time when Maine faces workforce challenges. There's a lot of focus that needs to be made in order to do this. So I'll just close by saying that I think that I'm looking forward, and I'm sorry I can't stay for the whole time, but my staff are on here to hearing what our regional neighbors are doing. We cannot do this alone. I will say the current unprecedented opportunity that all the states have is finally a federal government that is engaged on climate and energy issues with our region and with our entire country. Through the resources of the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the American Rescue Plan, our state is focusing on upgrading our grid, supporting moderate and low-income Mainers with the energy transition, deploying charging stations across our state, hardening our infrastructure to be able to respond to climate change. So huge opportunity, but also a need to deploy these resources in a streamlined and coordinated way. So I will just say it's an exciting time. It's an exciting time to continue to make progress. Again, our governor on December 1 is going to be highlighting the progress we've made over the last 2 years. And I think there's a lot of good news to share, but I will say there's a lot of heavy lifting that our state and our region and our country needs to do in the coming years to really meet these aggressive goals and be able to support our people to do this work to cost effectively make this transition. So I will leave it there. Again, I'm grateful to E2 Tech for focusing on what our neighbors around us are doing. And again, thank you, Marty.
Thanks, Hannah. Appreciate you jumping on and giving us a little bit of perspective to ground us in our discussion. And obviously Maine has been doing great work, and many of you on the call have been participating in that work and will continue to participate in that work. And Hannah, we really appreciate you being at the helm of that and being giving us clear leadership. What I'm going to transition to right now is three experts who we've gathered to talk to you a little bit about what other states are doing. And the reason for that is because some of those states, a fair amount of those states, have actually sort of begun their process a little bit earlier in time than Maine. So there's a lot of work that has already been done. Maine's been great. We've been working as quickly as possible, but some of these states have you know, gone through this process, and there is much to learn from them. And so in an effort not to work in silos and to also focus on regional collaboration, which is essential given that that Maine is part of a regional transmission organization, and of course all of our electricity is ultimately sort of intermingled. And as we've seen, projects depend on sort of mutual state cooperation. We thought it might be good to have a discussion on what's going on in our neighboring states. So today, to speak with you, our first speaker is Barbara Cates Garnick, who sometimes I will refer to as Bobby. And Barbara and Bobby is a professor of practice at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. She has a wide range of experience in the energy industry. She was, in her prior professional life, she was Undersecretary of Energy of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And in that role, she served as co-chair of the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act Advisory Committee. So she's been very involved in Massachusetts clean energy transition. So Barbara will be speaking with you about sort of all of the states from a higher level perspective. She's pretty active in monitoring what's going on, and will give us some thoughts both about what the states are doing, and also sort of from a more academic perspective, what her recommendations are in terms of what she thinks is working, and things that we could focus on as we move through our process. Our second speaker is Sheila Keene. Sheila is the Director of Analysis at the New England States Committee on Electricity, which we also call NESCO. NESCO, as a reminder, is a nonprofit organization that represents the 6 New England states governors in regional electricity matters. So they focus on, you know, encouraging a commitment to reliable electricity at a low price and consistent with environmental quality. In Sheila's prior life, she also brings some other experience to the table. She was most recently at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. She served in various positions there, but most recently as the Director of Regulatory and Regional and Federal Affairs. And before that, she was also an energy economist. So she brings a lot of insight to this discussion. We're excited to have her. And lastly, but not leastly, we have Jamie Dickerson, who's the Chief of Staff at NYSERDA, the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority, which is led by Doreen Harris. And the purpose of NYSERDA is actually a public benefit corporation to advance energy solutions through providing objective information analysis and innovative programs and technical expertise. And as you'll hear from Jamie, New York has been, through NYSERDA, has been at the forefront of sort of leading the clean energy transition, issuing procurements for clean energy, creating plans. And so he'll give us a sense of what New York has been able to do in the past few years and where they're going in this process. So I think what we're going to do is each of our speakers is going to give us a little bit of an intro, you know, as to what's going on from their perspective, and then which will probably be around 10 minutes or so a piece, and there'll be a few slides here and there, but this is also designed to be kind of a fireside chat. So we'll start out after they speak with some questions, just talking about current issues of the day with respect to the clean energy transition. And then we will be turning it over to you all. So I encourage you to think as you're listening to these panelists about questions that you would like to ask them, and put those in the Q&A panel. And then my job at the end will be to kind of curate those questions and bring them to the forefront for our panelists to respond to. So thank you. And Bobby, we'll start with you.
Great, and thank you very, very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I would like to say that I have strong connections to Maine from a personal level. So I am really thrilled to have this opportunity to participate. I thank people who put the program together. They've worked really hard, and to also hear from Hannah Pingree was quite a pleasure. So I have a really wonderful task. I have the opportunity to frame the conversation this morning, and I do hope it's a conversation, and I can do it from the world of academia, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, a school of global affairs, so that I can have no direct accountability, but I would love to throw out a few ideas. And I'd like to start this morning to say that, as we all know, and I feel like I say this a lot, you know, we are in the midst of this both exciting and I'm going to use the word terrifying transition, because we know that the consequences of the actions or the inaction that we don't take today will be something that we visit upon future generations. And that's really come home to me very much in my 8 years now of being a professor. So let's just mention the terrifying, because all we do is open a newspaper and where are we going to see a climate disaster? The floods in Pakistan, which have truly devastated a country. We have seen, obviously, in our own country, the results of Hurricane Ian, which has been terrifying as well. And then we've seen rivers dry up in Germany and China, in our own country. So we know we have a climate disaster. And at the same time, we're having this conversation at the time of the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. And really the focus right now is on what they're calling loss and damage, the impact that we have had on countries that did not contribute to this situation we have in terms of climate, but are really feeling the effects. So we're part of a broad conversation, even sitting where we are this morning. And obviously we know the opportunities. I think Hannah has laid them out, and that's the reason that we're here. We are in one of the most energy efficient areas of the country. We have incredible commitments to renewables. We've had RPS systems in our states for years. We've had RGGI, and we've set tremendous goals that we're going to try to meet by 2030, 2035, 2050. It'll be here really very quickly. And now offshore wind is giving us a new opportunity and a new challenge. So let me say that when I started to prepare for this, this discussion, I was noodling through the internet, and much to my surprise, I found out that October 2022, President Biden declared National Clean Energy Action Month. Now, you in state government may have known this, but that was not really clear to me, just as a citizen of the country. But I was excited to see that he made this proclamation, and he set out the strong goals of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. As Hannah alluded to, we finally have a federal government that actually can implement something, both with the Inflation Reduction Act, which we have all looked at very carefully, trying to understand what opportunities it will mean for us individually as states and as organizations and as companies. I think what's important about it was that it was really a focus on incentivizing the private sector and providing tax incentives rather than looking at things as a punishment. It was, let's give incentives. Let's move forward in that direction. I think that's a very important sea change, especially for those of us who have been in this world for many years trying to figure out how to put a price on carbon. So I think that that is really, really important. And I'm involved with an organization called Resources for the Future, and among some of their studies, they say that as incentives and fuel prices fall, we could see a lowering of electricity rates over time through these tax credits, up to $170 to $220 a year. So I think that's an interesting number. And it's something that we in New England obviously should feel could flow to our benefit. Of course, we know about the infrastructure law, but let's talk a little bit about EJ, because EJ is something that is really front and foremost now about how we move forward on the clean energy transition. And EJ is both for us in New England and for our citizens who have really experienced the huge impacts of pollution, but it's also something for those people in the producing states. And I think that we have to think about what this transition means to them as well. And environmental justice is the way that we look at it. And then this issue of higher energy costs. And always we see our connections as a region, but it really connects us to the rest of the globe. And I think that as we move forward in our own considerations, we realize that there is no such thing as energy independence, it's energy interdependence. But the International Energy Agency recently made a statement, and I think it's something that's relevant today for our conversation. They actually stated that the war in Ukraine is likely to speed, not slow, the shift to clean energy, although there are going to be pain points and delays along the way. So just in terms of placing, where we are today in the broader international context, I think is a very important thing to think about. The next thing I'd like to just raise briefly is some ideas and tools for innovation and collaboration as we deepen our clean energy policy. And I think it's really exciting to have New York on this call as well, because New York is doing some very innovative things as well. And this conversation will be very helpful. And one of the things that New York is doing is something called the Clean Energy Standards. Now, I know that we're all doing that, but I think New York has really sort of sharpened the focus on clean energy standards. And I guess a thought for me, and I like clean energy standards because they're technology neutral, and I think they have a lot of opportunity, particularly in this transition period that we're in. And, there's some thought that maybe there's a possibility of regional clean energy standards and even a federal clean energy standard. So I look forward to hearing from Jamie on some of what they're doing in New York. A more interesting question to me is how we use the social cost of carbon. And for those of you who are not that into that issue particularly, it's an estimate in dollars of the economic damages from emitting an additional ton of carbon into the atmosphere. And it really puts the economics of climate change into economic terms and is a great tool, as we all know, for us as policymakers to really understand the economic impacts of decisions to increase or decrease emissions. Well, we also know it's a very political tool because under the Trump administration, the social cost of carbon was very low. It was $7 a ton. The Obama administration and now Biden has put it again up to $51 a ton. And RFF, which I alluded to before, thinks that's actually too low. And the number could be as high as $185 a ton. So I think as states, it's a very great tool to use. And as we get into some of our arcane conversations, which we energy nerds love to do, it's a very interesting conversation to have. And I've heard also that the EPA is now trying to figure out how to apply it to methane. And methane is something that we need to be thinking about in New England very strongly as well. And the final thing, obviously, is something we're all engaged in, which is offshore wind. And just to say something to our friends in New York, again, the New York Bight auction was very exciting because it brought us $4.3 billion into the US Treasury. So just let me briefly talk about offshore wind as a catalyst of a lot of opportunity. And it brings in our favorite topic in New England, which is, of course, transmission. This we could talk on we've been talking about it for years, and going forward, I know we'll continue to have this conversation. So obviously, we're all aware of the FERC NOPR on this issue. And really, the challenge of offshore wind is how to integrate the dry and the wet and link the offshore wind into shore. And that brings us into transmission. Our transmission along the coast is much less than the transmission inland. So I think that's very important to discuss. We've had the benefit from other states recently of New Jersey, which just underwent a process with PJM and the BPU, their regulatory agency, on a state agreement approach. FERC got involved, and they just made a series of decisions on that. But I think for New England, this integration of the ISO New England and the states is very important to move forward. And we can also talk about how costs were allocated and cost recovery. But I think that for us is a very good thing to think about. And then, of course, and I know that others, Sheila probably and other panelists will talk about the New England RFI that has just come out and how we scale offshore wind. And one of the interesting questions is mesh ready. Now, what does mesh ready mean in terms of developing an offshore grid? And again, we can ask our colleague from New York to give us a little bit on their perspective. I would point out mesh ready is a very interesting issue because it also raises the issue of where we are today in terms of technology. When we implement mesh ready, if we decide to do that in our own offshore, who's making the decisions? When does it happen? Oh, my lights went off. Hold on. I guess I can't get them back. Okay, they're back. So that's another point that I need to talk about. And finally, I'm sure you're aware, but I'm just raising the information that NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and the federal government are involved in a lot of studies. Something is called the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transition Study, which is to evaluate and coordinate transmission solutions along the U.S. Atlantic coast. And I think it's a very important study that I'm sure that people in New England are following, but also figure out ways to engage, because basic decisions are going to be made as a result of this study. So in conclusion, we know that we're going to continue as states to play a critical role, but also now, as Hannah said, have a better partner in the federal government. And we do know elections matter. Even if the tools are there, how will they be implemented when we have changes of regime is a question. We need to sharpen our tools. And we also know that offshore wind is really very critical, but raises issues on the technology side and also the governance side. And one of the things that I think in New England we really need to pay attention to is the governance of the offshore wind. If we do build a network from Maine down to North Carolina, how are we going to govern it? And I think that we in New England as a regional entity should play a major role in that. So anyhow, in many issues, we're first out of the gate. Coordination with other states is really important. And I think we have a lot of challenges and opportunities ahead. So I hope that this has set a framework for the conversation that we're going to have next.
Thanks, Bobby. And next we have Sheila Keen from NESCO. Sheila, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to take a second to share my slides, which aren't too many. So hopefully I will. There we go. And are we good?
Yes. We can.
Okay, perfect. So thank you everyone for having me here. It is really such a great opportunity to be here to speak with you all. And thank you so much for inviting me and for spending your very early Thursday morning listening to this conversation, which I think is really important. And for those of you that don't know, I am Sheila Keen, the Director of Analysis at NESCO. And as Sarah mentioned, NESCO is a regional group that represents the collective views of the 6 New England states in regional electricity matters. and we are governed by a board of directors that is appointed by the governor of each state. And we are very lucky to have Chair Phil Bartlett as our manager from Maine. He is a tremendous person and a very thoughtful voice on these issues. I will just quickly say, to not get myself into trouble, that what I'm talking about here today are my own views. They don't represent the view of NESCO or any NESCO manager. That said, though, if you're interested in learning more about NESCO or our positions on different issues, please check out our website, and also feel free to reach out to me at any time. So following Bobby, who did such a great job just kind of putting us in a global context and bringing it back down regionally, I thought I'd just spend a few minutes talking about what's going on in some of the other New England states. I think some of this will be very familiar to people. Hopefully there's some new pieces in here, but I wanted to spend a minute kind of touching on all the states that have these different climate goals and how they're thinking about things. So as many of you probably already know, 5 of the 6 New England states have greenhouse gas reduction mandates of 80% or more by 2050. And how they're thinking about approaching this and how they're doing implementation really varies by state, in part just because each state has its own legislative and regulatory construct that influences how they'll pursue the policies. One thing that is common across all states is similar to Maine, that there is some sort of roadmap or clean energy plan that's helping them kind of be, I'd say, a kind of a flag in the ground, right? That they can turn to say, okay, we've thought about this. This is kind of what we're going to do going forward. Not all of them are award-winning like Maine's, but there are some really great ones out there. And a couple of common threads that you'll see throughout them is that they really are, like Maine's, quite comprehensive. So they're not just talking about clean electricity. They are talking about heating. They're talking about transportation. They're talking about new buildings, which is great. And I think they're quite expansive, right? So they cover lots of different sectors, and the plans seem to really be kind of the framing document, and there's different agencies involved in implementing all of these. I think you'll see variation by state. So Vermont, for example, is a vertically integrated state, the only one currently in New England. So how they think about kind of their electric system and their clean energy goals really focuses around that structure. It's just a slightly different structure than the other states have. You have states like Rhode Island that really, at least at the outset, have focused on putting their efforts into really aggressively building out their renewable portfolio standard, right? So they're going after that 100% renewables in the 2030 timeframe. They also have recently set a net zero by 2050 goal, and they are planning to release kind of a similar roadmap or study by the end of the year. So hopefully that will have some great information and give a better sense of where Rhode Island's looking to go in the coming months and years ahead. And then you have Connecticut with its integrated resource plan, and you have Massachusetts, which has its roadmap to decarbonization, which was a study done maybe slightly ahead of Maine's that has a lot of good analysis in it. That's they looked at kind of the power system and all the different sectors and the region. And actually a lot of that data has been used regionally to start looking kind of at our regional grid and what we might do going forward in terms of transmission planning and electric markets. And that's something I'll talk about briefly. I will say that Massachusetts, I'm a resident. We just had, with the election, we're going to have a new governor, and our governor-elect Maura Healey, it'll be really interesting to see what she does. Climate is certainly up front on her agenda, and she's talked about even appointing a cabinet level position to kind of oversee and bring together some of these climate efforts, because they really do span such a broad spectrum of sectors and efforts. And I will say another common thread that you'll see, and it's really not surprising, you hear it kind of anytime you hear about carbon goals or greenhouse gas reduction goals, is that you're going to electrify everything, right? You're going to electrify your transportation, you're going to electrify your heating, and then you're going to have a very clean power grid to help you support all those systems and make sure that your emissions are really as low as possible. And so in New England, that translates basically to a tremendous amount of new clean generation we'll need to support those growing loads. and the transmission infrastructure needed to unlock those resources and make sure that customers are being reliably served now and in the future. And so I'm going to focus on kind of the regional electric side, in part just because that's what I do. So in that sense, when we think about the regional grid and just the scale and scope of what needs to be done there, the states really have had this recognition that going it alone won't be enough. And you'll see that in the climate plans, right? So they talk about regional efforts, need to collaborate with other states, need to work with ISO New England, who's our regional grid operator. And that's really kind of where the region has been going, and the other states have been focusing a lot of efforts. And I will say, there's always been a real spirit of collaboration among the states that I've observed, at least. I mean, certainly at NESCO, I see the managers really engaging directly with each other and with the region writ large, just in a very collaborative spirit. And certainly even before NESCO, at the staff level, when I was in the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, we certainly spoke to staff from other states. I remember when Maine started its net energy metering program, we had staff reach out and say, gee, you guys have been doing this for a couple of years in Massachusetts. How did you think about these issues? Or, how did you approach this? I mean, at the end of the day, each state is going to take their best course forward, because not only do we have different kind of policy and political landscapes, but our physical infrastructure is very different. So what might work in Massachusetts might not work in Maine. I think we heard Hannah talk about, the different heating profiles in Maine, and, each state's going to be a little bit different, but I will say there's this general sense of collaboration has been long-standing. But what has been going on in the last few years has been a real sharp focus on making sure that the regional electric system, that the power grid is really accounting for the state clean energy goals. And that's not something that it was necessarily built or asked to do in the past. And so it's been saying, now going forward, these are our laws. This is going to be our future. Let's make sure we're all moving in the right direction. And so what happened a few years ago was in 2020, the New England states through NESCO put out a vision statement. And this was kind of a document that laid out their vision for a clean and affordable and reliable power system. And it focused on three major pillars. So it was the wholesale market design, transmission planning, which we'll touch on because that's really critical going forward, and also governance, right? So making sure that kind of the support system and the governance structures are there to help move this forward. And there has been a lot of work that has happened since 2020, and I will give kind of great credit to ISO New England as well as the regional stakeholders, that there's been a lot of support for this effort and a lot of great engagement that we've seen. So building on the vision statement, one thing that happened in response to the vision statement is that ISO New England has done some extra analysis. And one of the recommendations in the vision statement was to basically, the states were asking for a long-term infrastructure development roadmap to get us to 2050. And you're looking at a couple of different years along the way, so 2035, 2040, and 2050, and saying, what infrastructure, assuming that we're going to, have all this load growth, we're going to have all these new resources coming online, what do we need our transmission system to look like to get us there? Because while 2050 seems far away for you and I just sitting here today, in terms of transmission development, it's like tomorrow, because these projects take such a long time to design, to develop, to get built. That, as we all know, I think siting and permitting is a very challenging aspect of these projects. So that is underway, and we'll get some final results hopefully next year. But what we've seen so far in the preliminary results is we're going to need a lot of new infrastructure and upgrades to existing infrastructure. And so that's something, part of what the states have been doing around the 2050 study is to also think about, okay, let's make this regular, right? This shouldn't be a one-time study. Let's do studies like this pretty regularly, so we're able to kind of monitor our progress and see where we're going. And then two, next year, in the coming year, the states are going to be working with ISO to develop a set of rules that will allow them to operationalize the results of this study. So if this study comes out and there's kind of, we'll call it a no regrets option, where it's like, gee, in every scenario we looked at, there's this one transmission solution that seems to really will help us unlock something. A state or states might wish to pursue that. And so it's laying kind of the rules of how that process would go, and importantly, kind of some of the cost allocation mechanisms around that. And then another thing, and Bobby touched on this, that the states are doing, and this isn't an ESCO initiative, I think it's a really great example of kind of the regional collaboration we're seeing, is the New England States Transmission Initiative. So they put out a request for information to explore transmission infrastructure needed to integrate clean energy with a focus on offshore wind. And it included a conceptual framework for an offshore wind development plan. And what you'll see is kind of with an eye towards getting some federal funding. I think that was very clear in the RFI, that the states are coming together as a region, trying to kind of take advantage of these funds that are out there, in recognition that this is a significant amount of investment. And, you know, I think leveraging federal funds is a great way to hopefully advance some of these initiatives. I'm going to just kind of stop here as a framing. I hope that this was helpful, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I think it's a lot more interesting than listening to me talk to a couple of slides. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Sheila. And so next we're going to talk with Jamie Dickerson, who is Chief of Staff at NYSERDA, who's going to give us the New York perspective, and then we'll start having a roundtable discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. And thank you to E2 Tech at large and my fellow panelists for the great conversation today. Thrilled to be a part of it. If you're not familiar with NYSERDA, we are New York's clean energy agency, if you will, in short, sort of like a combined version of DOER and Mass CEC in Massachusetts, if you've worked there. But we're the state energy office. We administer programs for consumers, for EV rebates, low income weatherization, community solar. As our name suggests, we do play a pretty major role in climate tech R&D and innovation. And we also do often play the role played by utilities in other states, as we are the big buyer, if you will, of renewable energy credits through our long-term contracting RFPs, plus a whole lot more. But that's us in a nutshell. And I will say, as a brief aside, it's great to be back with E2 Tech, a fantastic group that I previously had the chance to work with directly in my prior roles at the Northeast Clean Energy Council. So many fond memories of clean energy days and up in Augusta, alongside many of you who are surely in the audience listening. So my focus today is really to try and share some insights on how New York is advancing our grid transition, both from a sort of a supply perspective, a generation perspective, and from that transmission and infrastructure viewpoint. Having worked for many years in New England, I'm certainly keenly aware of many of the differences and similarities between our two neighboring regions. For one, obviously New York is a single state regional transmission organization or independent system operator, the NYSO as we call it, which I think commonly does present us with the benefits of greater autonomy and control compared to the multi-state ISO context of ISO New England. But we do have similar capacity market and energy market structures, but all within the context of one state. But I think sometimes that just means that while multi-state ISOs get to duke it out over issues of cost allocation and such across state lines, that just means that we have to do those debates at the state and the sub-state level here in New York. And there are, after all, 11 wholesale market zones across the big state of New York. And Zone K, Long Island, is as different from places in upstate New York as you can imagine that Cape Cod is from upstate, from northern Maine, et cetera. So. But I think it also is notable that our regions inhabit, roughly the same climate zones and range of heating and cooling degree days. So I think the planning scenarios that I'll walk through should inform a similar perspective across the New York and New England regions. So as I think Hannah pointed out earlier, we collaborate directly all the time, we being New York and New England. Reggie, as Hannah mentioned, but also more recently, we've been really happy to work with Maine and several other Northeast states on our application to the Department of Energy for a really exciting Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub Award opportunity that is currently active. So yeah, super exciting stuff. So I'm going to pull up a relatively short set of slides to give you more of a specific window into what we've been up to here in the Empire State. If you'll just bear with me one moment. And tell me if the slides are okay or if they're swapped to the presenter view, and I'll switch them.
Do that swap thing, Jamie. And by the way, we miss you in Clean Energy Days and so forth. And yeah, that looks great.
Marvelous. Okay. So I wanted to start to flash up this, this slide of some of New York's really ambitious clean energy goals. I will say, if you're not aware, all of our work is guided by a 2019 piece of legislation that was passed called the CLCPA, or the Climate Act. By many accounts, one of the most aggressive climate and clean energy laws in the US. It's got goals for near and long-term greenhouse gas emissions reductions, 85% by mid-century by 2050. We've also got 100% zero emission electricity goals by 2040, and lots of interim goals between now and then that you can see laid out on the slide. Sorry, it's a little bit of an eye chart, but you can see sort of the progression for storage, for distributed solar, for large-scale renewables, for building decarbonization, for vehicle transition, et cetera. I will note, I was glad Bobby brought up environmental justice, and I do want to point out that embedded in all of these goals and New York's Climate Act writ large is the core principle of energy and climate equity. So there's lots of provisions in the act that sort of impose requirements for New York regulations that will be developed, as well as governing the sort of the distribution of clean energy funds and benefits to New York's disadvantaged communities. So that is also a huge component here. So the entity that's sort of charged with mapping out how New York is going to achieve these goals is the Climate Action Council. We too have a Climate Action Council in New York. So we've been hard at work for the better part of the last 3 years getting our scoping plan ready for finalization, which will occur by the end of this year, which is really exciting. So we're in the home stretch, but a lot more work to do for sure. Okay, let me switch slides. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but I show it to underscore that sort of the economy-wide nature of our work anchors all of our work on grid and renewables. It's because it's calibrated to the North Star of deep emissions reductions. For 2030, we're talking about 40% below the 1990 baseline, which is a huge lift, to say the least. On the right, you can see the breakdown of the emissions sectors in New York's economy. Pretty similar, but I think a heavier emphasis on the building sector compared to what Hannah showed for Maine and transportation. So across the three big, sort of the big three emitting sectors, buildings, transportation, and electricity, that's where our pillars of action emerge, if you will, for driving renewable growth on the grid, for converting most of our building stock to building electrification, and achieving clean transportation. So that's where we start from. And it suggests sort of a framing point, which is that New York's grid is going to need to grow a heck of a lot over the next 3 decades. On the left-hand axis here, you see gigawatt hours of annual demand over the next 30 years. So when you're talking about growing from more than 150 million megawatt hours consumed per year to more than 300 million megawatt hours per year by 2050, obviously you can do the math. That's a doubling in 3 decades. We're talking about the peak of our system shifting to the winter and sometime likely in the 2030s as we convert a lot of our space heating needs to electric sources, heat pumps and the like. And you can see sort of how the the mix of resources evolves over the coming decades. Because we have that, very strong clean energy standard, which Bobby mentioned, and I'll talk about a little bit further, a very significant portion of our supply mix is expected to be, wind, water, solar, renewable energy. But obviously you see significant slices in there for nuclear generation from the existing fleet in New York, as well as other future sort of zero emission resources, which I think we all know is a need that's going to need to evolve across all of our regions in the years ahead. So from there, what did New York do? Well, among other things, we started with a power grid study. This was something that was required by a 2020 piece of legislation, a separate piece of legislation. But so NYSERDA, we worked with our colleagues at the Department of Public Service to issue this comprehensive report on the power grid, looking at local transmission and distribution needs, the ability of our grid to interconnect our offshore wind goals and achieve 70% renewables by 2030, and then ultimately 100% zero emission electricity by 2040. So we do see a substantial opportunity and really a need to accelerate transmission expansion projects to really accommodate future renewable generation, to make sure that they're not constrained, renewable megawatt hours aren't bottlenecked or getting curtailed. I'll talk about it in a minute, but we do have, some of our recent transmission projects will thankfully relieve a lot of the sort of system-wide congestion concerns that we saw on our grid. So that's going to be a huge help. There is going to be a new tie line that we foresee being needed between Long Island and New York, really related directly to offshore wind delivery and integration. And the power grid study also informed a lot of our thinking around the mesh ready concept, which you heard Bobby allude to earlier, and I'll speak more to in the context of our upcoming offshore wind RFP. So, and I think, it's clear there's also a need to coordinate the placement of energy storage technologies. We've got a brand new goal from Governor Hochul of 6 gigawatts of storage by 2030, and we're in the process of finalizing New York's sort of energy storage roadmap 2.0 in the coming months to really achieve that, or to spell out what that would look like. So lots of changes expected as a result of the power grid study, and that led to some more sort of discrete, Public Service Commission proceedings and utility filings to sort of respond to and implement that power grid study. So the PSC directed utilities to proceed with this sort of first phase, if you will, of near-term grid improvements that were noted in the study, and then to conduct some analysis on the bigger second phase of projects. So in July, the PSC approved the first suite of national grid projects in the upstate area, and is now considering proposals submitted by other utilities. And it's going to be a sort of statewide submission of additional studies for transmission upgrades by 2023. Here's where we get into the acronym soup, but we've got a coordinated grid planning process, CGPP filing that's coming up, that's sort of coordinating across utilities, what the local transmission and distribution upgrade process will look like. So that's going to be proceeding. And in addition, as I mentioned, the PSC did issue an order declaring that there is a public policy transmission need, a PPTN, on Long Island, which is going to help make that, really solidify that connectivity for offshore wind between Long Island and New York City. So that on that front, the New York Independent System Operator is currently evaluating projects and expects to provide a project ranking in the first half of next year to figure out what that transmission solution is going to look like. So here's where I'd like to talk about our clean energy standard, which Bobby teed me up perfectly for. So a clean energy standard is very similar to a renewable portfolio standard in RPS, but it is more technologically expansive. There are multiple tiers. We've got our new renewables, which we call tier 1. We've got existing renewables, hydro and wind predominantly, that we call tier 2. And we've got this relatively new tier aimed at providing transmission and clean energy to New York City, which we call tier 4. And the sort of the missing tier 3 there is the support for New York's nuclear facilities under the ZEC program. But this work was really all kicked off with a CES 2.0 white paper, which was a collaboration between my agency, NYSERDA, and the DPS team, and then an order by the Public Service Commission from October 2020. So both of those documents really, explored and then ultimately codified. Okay, if we have to achieve 70% renewable electricity by 2030, first of all, how much load do we think we're going to have in 2030? From there, how much renewables do we think we're going to need to buy and build every year to get there, recognizing how long it takes to build projects in New York, which can, if you don't know, can take a long time. So then how will the RECs be procured and then sort of allocated? How will costs be allocated across load serving entities and customers? So that CES, the sort of central comprehensive CES proceeding at the Public Service Commission has been where, a lot of this work has taken place. So you can see sort of our progress to date laid out on the slide. And I think it's a pretty good story. We do have the benefit of a very strong foundation of existing operating renewables in New York, 27% of state load today. Basically, NYSERDA has spent the last 5 to 6 years procuring a metric ton, if you will, of renewables every year, both in terms of large scale land-based renewables and offshore wind. And you can see the breakdown there on the second donut chart. So with our baseline and what we've been purchasing, once that all gets built, that would theoretically bring us to 66% toward that 70% goal for 2030. So we've got a lot of building left to do, and we're even going to be procuring above and beyond 70%, knowing that there's always a risk for some project attrition, and really knowing that, as I shared, because our load is going to be increasing, so too does our generation need to increase above and beyond where it is today. So very exciting. I don't want to overlook the distributed solar contribution here. New York has a really roaring community solar market. I think the #1 state market in the nation right now. And as you can see, that's actually contributing not insignificantly to our overall CES goals as well. So when you're talking about 10 gigawatts of community solar by 2030, that's pretty significant as well. So here's a visual depiction of where these projects actually are taking place in New York. You can see there's great sort of geographic diversity, although obviously not much room for large scale wind and solar in the downstate region, but certainly that's where offshore wind comes into play. And you can see in the blue and the yellow lines, we've got these 2 awesome transmission projects that we procured in the last year or so, and which will now are under development and sort of racing ahead to get built to deliver clean electrons into New York City in the latter part of this decade, which I'll talk about now. So these were the 2 largest transmission projects in New York State really in the last 50 years. At the approval of the Public Service Commission, NYSERDA ran an RFP similar to the 83D RFP in Massachusetts to really solicit projects delivering immense volumes of clean electricity, specifically into New York City, or Zone J, as we call it. And ultimately, after a very rigorous, review and evaluation process, we selected, and then the PSC approved contracts for long-term contracts for renewables and their accompanying transmission capacity from these 2 projects that you see here: the Chippy project, Champlain Hudson Power Express, which will be bringing predominantly hydropower from Hydro-Quebec in Canada down all the way there in the blue line to New York City, HVDC line, and similarly the Clean Path New York project, which is going to be bringing new solar and wind from upstate, along with pumped hydro storage upstate into New York City as well, also via new HVDC transmission capacity. So I know there are lots of corollaries between, what we were able to do, what Massachusetts and other parts of New England have been and continue to seek to do, certainly with a Maine nexus, and we can get into that in the comments after I wrap up my remarks in the next few minutes here. So, but really excited about these 2 projects. They really are game changers for, what historically has been a relatively dirtier grid in New York City compared to upstate. So I'm going to race through these last few, but just because Bobby talked about the mesh ready concept, we do have an offshore wind solicitation that's on the street right now, which we're super excited about. These RFPs, they're becoming pretty beastly. We're not just buying RECs, there's a ton more in there on, social and economic factors, environmental factors, sort of the future proofing factors for resilience and for the connectivity of the offshore wind transmission system. That mesh ready concept is really just making sure that we don't build offshore wind projects with lead lines with no infrastructure ability to sort of connect horizontally, if you will, with other transmission projects, either on the dry or the wet side. So we have required all of our bidders to submit proposals that are in fact mesh ready and able to be integrated with future sort of connective tissue, if you will, between and among offshore wind generation resources across the region. So super exciting. We'll have big news after we get bids submitted and evaluated and ultimately awarded next year. So stay tuned for that. We're marching ahead to our 9 gigawatt goal by 2035. And we've basically run an annual large-scale solicitation for land-based renewables. And you can see here is where the connectivity between that power grid study and these solicitation activity really lies. We took the outputs of the power grid study, where are we going to foresee deliverability constraints, curtailment risks, et cetera, in these regions that you see on the slide. And then we're going to require the projects that bid into our contracts to really conduct their own deliverability studies if they're cited in some of these areas where we see risk of insufficient headroom for new renewables. So also very exciting. That RFP is also on the street as we speak right now too. So I think that's it. I will stop sharing and just close with my repeated thanks for the whole group and looking forward to diving into the Q&A.
All right, thank you, Jamie. So just as a reminder, we have a Q&A panel that you can type your questions into, and we will get to that in a minute. But I think I just want to start out with a few questions. One of the reasons that we had this forum is to sort of understand how the states are organizing this clean energy transition. And I noticed, Jamie, that New York basically started with some fundamental studies, the power grid study and the distribution planning, and you've got your offshore wind RFP running, and then you are now creating your sort of scoping plan. Whereas it seems like some of the other states had started with a more overarching scoping plan, and then are now moving into the distribution and transmission planning studies and trying to identify can you just talk a little bit about why it was organized that way and the advantages and disadvantages of that? Mindful that some other states have done different organizational structures.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the short answer is that we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. And in fact, even though we're still finalizing our scoping plan for the end of this year, at the end of last year, we had to produce a substantially similar draft of that scoping plan. So I think the two tracks have been proceeding really in parallel, and it stems again from legislative directives that have emerged in New York State. So in 2019, the legislature passed the Big Climate Act. They said, okay, we need a scoping plan, a draft by the end of 21, and a final plan by the end of 22. So that's organized all of our work. But then that other 2020 legislation that I mentioned, which initiated the power grid study, that required the submission of that study, I think by the end of 2021. So, we have to do both. We have to do the big picture, 2050 economy-wide planning, but we know that our renewable and our grid needs will sort of be immense either way. And so that's why we were able to proceed with the more granular nitty-gritty grid planning activity in the sort of the nearer term, so that we can get those dominoes falling, get the utilities to submit their phase 1 plans, so that our upcoming renewable RFPs aren't hampered by a lack of transmission upgrades in the near term.
And Sheila, I want to bring you into this discussion. I mean, you have some experience both as coordinating the New England states through NESCO and seeing how the states are working together, but also in your previous role in Massachusetts. How is Massachusetts balancing that from what you can tell, balancing that sort of what Jamie was talking about, that large scale economy-wide planning with the nitty-gritty sort of more nuts and bolts planning of, grid build out, cost allocation, sort of resource procurement, which we are very aware of. Massachusetts has been very active in. Can you just talk a little bit about how Massachusetts has organizationally approached this?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it. And I know Bobby has lots of experience there too, so she can
That would be
add
great.
color, correct me. I will say, at least in terms of the procurement, a lot of that, kind of similar to New York, it seems like has been legislatively driven, right? So it kind of came down, and that was something that the agencies needed to work with and go out with these procurements. On the transmission and distribution planning, it's interesting, and I think this is where you get into the difference between a single state perhaps and a multi-state situation, where, New England, we're kind of a very tightly interconnected transmission system, and it's not something that most of the states plan for in the traditional way. Vermont certainly does as a vertically integrated state. And I think that's where you're starting to see this effort at the regional level, and Massachusetts has been very active in these discussions, as has Maine and the other states, is saying, we actually need a longer term plan, right? Typically, ISO New England only plans 10 years out, and they plan kind of in their own kind of needs parameters. And we need to start thinking more broadly. We need to think about our what our future is going to look like in 2050. And I think that actually the roadmap that Massachusetts developed did have a lot of transmission and load and kind of electrification analysis. And so that data has actually been the underpinning of the 2050 transmission study, and as well as other regional studies that have been going on. So I think that data actually has been used to great effect regionally. And then certainly on the distribution side, I understand that the Department of Public Utilities is kind of undertaking its own efforts there to talk about distribution system planning. I would imagine it's, similar in other states, because those tend to be the authorities that really oversee the distribution companies and their planning.
What do you think, Bobby?
I mean, I think Sheila really captured. I would like to give a little plug to Connecticut too, because I think that Connecticut has played a major role in a lot of these conversations. And even though they're not on the panel, Katie Dykes has really been a leader in this as well. And I really think that now the question is this integration of the market going forward, and the integration of this planning, and then adding all of the complexities of renewables, makes the challenge, well, it's a challenge for New York. I'm a little bit familiar with New York as well, in that the law that they have is a really strong driver. But when you're dealing with multiple laws in multiple states, I think the complexity of this becomes much larger, and I know NESCO faces this on a daily basis. So I just think we need to add these issues in, so that New York is very focused, but and their pressure is upstate, downstate, and we have to get all the regional entities and the policies and the politics as these governors get elected or don't get elected. So I just add that, but I think Sheila answered the question well.
All right. One of the things that we've been sort of focusing on is sort of the opportunities for regional collaboration, and with that comes questions about sort of how are costs going to be allocated, and also differing priorities. Like, not everybody, and Sheila, I'm sure, is very attuned to this, not everybody is prioritizing things the same way. I want to just talk a little bit about, and we've also talked about sort of all the transmission build out that needs to happen. This tension between the transition that is needed, the money that is going to be required, and how it's going to be paid for is a significant challenge to the planning that needs to happen, and effectuating all of what needs to occur to get to these goals. And so I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about how you've approached how this from perspective of Bobby and Sheila, maybe a little bit about how the states in New England have approached sort of the cost sharing, cost allocation for some of this build out. And then Jamie, obviously you were talking about the recent transmission successes, really, to get them actually to the point at which they can be built out. You know, how is cost and cost allocation playing into this? Because, you know, obviously that's a real sensitive subject right now, given all the expenses that our consumers have to bear. Bobby, you want to start? You can,
Yeah, I have to unmute. So let me, I'm going to let Sheila talk a little bit about New England, but let me talk to you a little bit about New Jersey, because I think that New Jersey has done a lot of very interesting work in this as relates to offshore wind. And I'm sure that people in the decision makers in the New England states have been following the New Jersey the state agreement approach. And they made a decision, they went to FERC when they got approval for the BPU and you know, PJM linkage on offshore wind. And I guess the decision that came out of that is that entity that caused the increase in costs for the transmission will pay for the increase in cost of transmission. And again, I didn't get into the details of how this was going to be allocated among, you know, the costs, but I think it's a really interesting issue. We have a federal government now that has new tools in this whole transmission issue. And I think that that's what the RFI is going to help us better understand, is whether there are federal opportunities here to move forward. So, you know, before Sheila answers, I just wanted to make those two comments. One, we have a model of New Jersey. We may have to look at it and study and does it work for us? Two, how then are we going to use the dollars from the federal government? And if we do go into the federal government, what concessions as decision makers do we have to make to get the federal money? You know, I'm sure there are going to be some trade-offs here, and I'm not sure what they are at this moment, but we have to think about that as well. So before Sheila answered, I just wanted to get those conceptual thoughts out there.
Sheila, what do you think? Thanks, Bobby. Sheila, what do you think in terms of sort of how cost is playing into this transition, both from what you're seeing at NESCO and then obviously in Massachusetts in your prior role?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly it's one of those things that's never far from mind, right? It's particularly in these days. And I think what we've seen recently is, at least with this in the terms of the 2050 transmission study, and really kind of working with ISO to turn that into a regular repeated process that the states will then be able to use to go out and get transmission, to make those solicitations or work on that project development. I think the fact that those conversations are slated to start happening shortly, I think that is going to be, you know, there's going to be probably a lot of discussion, perhaps difficult discussions, but I think it's really encouraging that that's where the region's going. You know, it's challenging, and I think we also might get federal direction from the FERC. They have their transmission NOPR out there. They have thoughts about cost allocation, and we'll see, you know, if we might get some directive from them that might also kind of shift the landscape in terms of how the states are thinking about it. I will just say, though, you know, when we talk about different state priorities, different state policies, one thing that I think New England is very good at is I always see the 6 states engaging with each other in spite of those differences. So you'll see in the RFI, for example, you'll notice that I noticed Vermont wasn't a participating state. And again, this wasn't a NESCO initiative, but they're involved, they're active, they're following it, you know, they're invested in it. And we see that too for states, you know, like New Hampshire, that doesn't have the same clean energy goals as the other states. They're active in these conversations. They are, you know, they are participating. So I think there is that real collaborative spirit in spite of perhaps policy differences. And I think the conversations are the better for it.
Thank you. Jamie, you talked earlier about just sort of still staying on the cost piece, you know, you talked earlier about the differences. Yeah, yes, you are one state, but there's quite a fair amount of variability within the state, and obviously there's load that's driving transmission build out. You know, load is in a different area than potentially where the generation is located, yet we have these huge transmission projects. And so if you could talk a little bit about how NYSERDA has been approaching costs, if it's taking those costs into account, and how New York is sort of trying to deal with this tension of the infrastructure build out that's needed, and how to pay for it.
Yeah, it really is in some ways the central question of all of this activity, right? I think we've done a couple things. As you noted, there are sort of intrastate sort of inherent tensions, if you will. If the upstate communities where many large-scale renewables are being located are benefiting for those, should Long Islanders be paying for those contracts, or vice versa? You know, should the upstate industrial facility be helping pay for contracts to build new transmission lines to New York City, or offshore wind to New York City and Long Island? But I think the way we've been thinking about it is that all of these assets and resources are fundamental to statewide policy goals, and therefore, by and large, with I think only a few exceptions, we've really been focusing on a statewide sort of load share cost allocation for much of the sort of the grid scale, you know, system-wide resources that we're talking about here. Certainly, if there are local transmission upgrades, that's one thing for that set of customers. But I do think that has helped, and there are sort of counterbalancing dynamics that help reach somewhat of an equilibrium. But there are a couple of other mechanisms we've employed. For one, we've converted our contracts to what are called index REC contracts. These are sort of these incredibly Byzantine mechanisms, but basically, instead of just getting a static REC cost like dollar per megawatt hour, basically the projects are bidding in to us and getting a contract that has an overall strike price, which reflects both the commodity costs that they can reap from wholesale markets as well as REC costs. So if you have $100 per megawatt hour strike price and your energy market revenues are going up, then the cost that the state has to pay in a REC inherently will go down. So it reduces some risk on the revenue side for the project, and it also insulates ratepayers from potentially overpaying in situations when there are high commodity market prices during the period of these contracts, which is good. The other thing that we've benefited from is some very active sort of voluntary purchaser activity. I think very important to getting the tier 4, the 2 projects across the finish line, was that New York City's municipal government stepped up and purchased a pretty significant portion of those 2 transmission project deliveries. So that, again, is a cost that's taken away from ratepayers and shifted on to New York City municipal operations. And I think there will be potentially further activity that follows from New York City's own local law construct, and other entities that might be interested in sort of voluntary sort of REC purchasing activity in the years ahead. So I think we need all of the tools in our toolkit to help sort of figure out the cost item. And as Bobby mentioned, I think the new federal law is really a game changer. Over the next 30 years, our analysis suggests that could save the IRA and Infrastructure Act could save New York on the order of $70 billion in net costs that are sort of realized by New York State, you know, customers and ratepayers and taxpayers. So hugely game changer from that perspective. And I think there is even more federal dollars that we are well poised to win as a result of being sort of a first mover in this space.
So Jamie, could I ask you a question? Could I ask you, the fact that you said that New York City has stepped up to the plate, is New York City in terms of an energy buyer? It would just be very helpful to sort of for us to understand that relationship. And also, I don't know if everybody here is familiar sort of with the role of NYSERDA as a purchaser of RECs, because it's a different system, but there may be ways that we in New England can sort of, you know, learn or get some ideas from you. So those would be 2 very specific questions that I think would be helpful for us to understand.
Sure. I'm not sure I have the total number off the top of my head, but for the 2 tier 4 projects, we're talking about something like 18 million megawatt hours a year once those 2 projects are operational and delivering energy into New York City. So I forget the the portion of that New York City stepped up to buy, but it was multiple million megawatt hours per year. So New York City's city government operations are pretty significant energy users. So they were able to soak up, a not insignificant portion of that volume and therefore that cost in a way that it saved money for New York State ratepayers. So that was good. And as you mentioned, we do have a unique sort of agency arrangement here. There isn't really a corollary for NYSERDA in the New England region in terms of a centralized contracting and procurement entity for a lot of this work. I think there are some models. I think the offshore wind transmission RFI or RFP is an example. The long ago in history, the old tri-state RFP was an example of states pooling together their buying power to sort of solicit for a common set of resources. But yeah, our agency sort of sits not atop, but sort of as an umbrella over all the load serving entities in New York State. So we don't have the individual utilities going out for RFPs. We're the big buyer, and then we sort of sell our RECs to the load serving entities for their compliance obligations under the CES. So I think it is helpful because projects know there's one place to go. They can get really strong contractual terms and sort of financial security and guarantee under the centralized contract, and the centralized administration does bring economic efficiencies, I think. So I don't know if there's an easy way to replicate that on a copy paste basis to other states, but certainly we'd be more than happy to discuss.
All right. Shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of sort of dispatchable resources, and which is a sort of the concept is, it's a wonky term, but the concept is, all of these clean energy transitions, and zero emitting resources, the effort to get all these renewable resources online. As Jamie's slide showed, you are resulting in significant increases in more intermittent types of resources, and solar, wind, and the question is, how do you see the more dispatchable resources? How are the states looking at that? And right now, those dispatchable resources are natural gas. And obviously oil, which everybody's trying to move away from because of the emissions. But how are you viewing that as backstopping or sort of providing a landscape for the ability to integrate all of these clean emitting resources? If you can speak to that at all.
Sorry, was that to me too? I'm happy
Yeah,
to jump
I think
in.
that's I start with Jamie, and then it just sort of like talk a little bit about New England afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, so it's definitely true. Although we envision that wind, water, solar will comprise a substantial supermajority of our gigawatt hours in the future decades, there is definitely a need for that zero emission dispatchable resource class. And we think it's going to have a very low capacity factor. It's just during those few periods of years when sort of the dark doldrums, when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, that's when we're going to need these resources to be able to stay in tune with demand. I think it's very clear this is like the sweet spot for the R&D work that we're doing. We don't necessarily know what this solution set will fully be in the 2030s and 40s. It could be green hydrogen fuel cells. It could be RNG potentially in lieu of fossil gas. And there's a sort of a whole set of others that I think could play a role. So we're definitely keeping our options open and constantly evaluating, long duration energy storage technologies, other applications that can fill that need. And one thing I would point out is that I think we always overlook the ability for our demand side to actually play that role of providing sort of the equivalent dispatchable, sort of the inverse of a megawatt that can be responsive. I mean, if you just think about how many EVs are going to be on the road by 2035, if they all have whatever, a 50 kilowatt hour battery pack in them, and 90% of them are home and not driving at any given time, or whatever the stat is, that stacks up to some pretty, strong dispatchable demand resources. And the same with the heat pump water heater. And so I think the sort of the smart grid and the grid modernization side, so that all those devices can be communicating with each other and utilities and the grid operator, I think that's going to be an under-heralded resource that will help achieve that sort of dispatchability function in the later years.
So Bobby and Sheila, following up on what Jamie was talking about, how is New England, to the extent that you can speak to it, thinking about dispatchable resources as a backstop for the clean energy transition that needs to happen. And I know that ISO New England has been looking at that in their future grid reliability study. And if you want to comment on sort of Jamie's point about the possibility of sort of storage and demand reduction being also playing into that balancing role of taking on all these intermittent resources, how are New England states sort of dealing with that in the climate transition discussion?
So I'll take a first crack. So just mentioning the future grid reliability study, I think that study is fascinating. It's really interesting. It looked at a bunch of different future scenarios, but there was again that kind of carbon compliance scenario that was derived from the Massachusetts pathway study that they're using for the transmission study as well. And the amount of dispatchable resources we'll need is pretty significant in 2050. We're going to use them very differently, right? So, but we're going to need them. And what was interesting to me on the storage front is that, in New England, I think one of the things that we're thinking about right now is kind of the fact that we'll probably be a winter peaking system, that's not too far away. And we get New England weather, and sometimes it's cold for a really long time. And even now, those longer term cold periods are challenging, right, to manage through for the power system. And in those longer term periods, the storage technologies we have right now aren't necessarily going to be the solution, right? There might not be enough power for them to actually charge if we have 2 weeks of a very cold snap. So I think, kind of to Jamie's point, that seems to me like a place where kind of industry and research and development can really kind of fill that gap. We're talking about needs in 2050, and I think the technology we'll have available will be very different. But I will say, in addition to Maine, you've got Massachusetts and Connecticut both have kind of storage goals and targets where they're rolling out storage and really thinking about trying to kind of how they can use that and integrate that into the clean energy transition. I think there's a lot of potential there, and the states are working towards that.
Yeah, we have some big storage projects moving their way through the Massachusetts siting process, so that's exciting. Bobby, do you have any comment on sort of the role of dispatchable resources or demand resources and sort of balancing the sort of clean intermittent? I mean, it may not quite be in your wheelhouse, and if so, that's okay.
No, the only comment to make, and just from years of experience, is I raised two points that we have to consider. One is that the issue is timing, and what is the appropriate timing for all of these resources to sort of either replace each other, come online. The worst thing for us, I think, would be from a political perspective, is to find ourselves in a situation where all of a sudden we don't have enough resources available at that one moment that we need them, because we know then that those type of situations can drive bad decision making. So I think that that's one point. And the other point really is doing cost analysis and trying to figure out mechanisms within the rate structure to deal with these transitions. And I think that is a really complicated but very necessary part of it, because I was part of the whole deregulation experience when we placed a surcharge and we went through a process of valuing plants and resources, and it worked. We did have a long-term charge on our bill, and we were willing to accept that. So as we go forward, we need to keep in mind, what are these mechanisms going to be? And how are we going to structure them? And only one other comment is that we tend to think very piecemeal on these issues. And how do we begin to get this decision-making integrated so that we're looking at, how we're going to deal with this transition, how the costs are going to be felt, what kind of mechanisms, when if we put on surcharges. And I think that the one thing we're finding is that our electricity bills are the repository of a lot of policy decisions, and which comes back to the interesting comment of New York, because obviously New York City said it's a taxpayer issue in certain respects if the city has taken this up, not a ratepayer issue. So, we have to have these conversations and figure out a way to approach it from a policy. So that's my only additional comment.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was just on a panel last week at the New England Canada Business Council, and Canada basically took it out of, or sort of had a mechanism, I don't know the precise mechanism, but to take some of these costs out of electricity rates and into a more general charge to all of their citizens. So it's an interesting concept. Whether we could actually do that is another question altogether. I want to open it up because, of course, part of the fun of this is to have audience participation. So I'm going to do my best. We have quite a few questions here, so I'm going to do my best to sort of not bounce around too much, but I'm not sure how successful I'm going to be. But I think some of these are specific questions about Maine, and I'm actually not going to ask the panelists specific questions about Maine. So hold those because we'll have a Maine climate forum in the future, and then we'll have experts who can talk about Maine. But there's a couple of there are a couple of questions about New York and transmission and distribution planning. And I'm going to try and group them. The one is from Nancy Chandler, who asked about what is the New England energy distribution planning, what's being done in New York under the energy distribution planning and maybe transmission planning too, to reduce the distance that the electricity must travel to end users. And sort of question about are microgrids part of the equation? And then in the same bucket of sort of transmission and transmission planning, how do sort of community benefits, it's a little bit disparate, I admit, I'm trying to link it together, it's not quite effective, but how do community benefits, play into addressing disparity of impacts when we're talking about, how to deal with paying for transmission and getting transmission up and running. So Jamie, those are yours.
Yeah, no, two great questions. I do think as a general theme, we definitely see the decentralization of like the distribution outward to the edges of the grid of the generation, the supply mix. I think community solar having 10 gigawatts that we didn't have 10 years ago in the next, 7 years is going to put a lot of that generation much closer on the local distribution network than it ever used to be. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, with aggregated fleets of home batteries and EVs in people's residences, increasingly, I think that will maybe, if not widespread microgrid adoption, widespread ability to tap into sort of the networked combinations of supply and demand at the sort of local distribution level increasingly. I think microgrids, it was something I sort of looked a lot at several years ago under the New York Prize program. The challenge that we encountered there was just how do you match up the resilience question with the clean question, right? Do you have to rely on a fossil gas resource to be the backbone of a microgrid? And I think one really good piece of news about our foray into clean hydrogen is that we do foresee a significant opportunity for fuel cell, green hydrogen, anchored microgrid opportunities for those critical facilities like hospitals and the like in the future. So that's one potential use case that we're exploring under our hydrogen hub application that we're again developing with other regional partners. So I do think we foresee a burgeoning prospects for the how real it could be to have a fully clean microgrid for those critical applications in the future. And the second question was that was just the first, I think.
The first was community benefits. Did we talk about
That's right.
that?
Yeah, so just briefly, there is a part of the 2020 law that I mentioned earlier does require community benefit agreements for our large scale renewable projects in terms of their host communities. So that's something that every project has to, negotiate and as part of their application to the state. And from the state's perspective, we're certainly evaluating economic development and economic investments, job creation, contributions to local communities as part of our evaluation of projects. We have a 70-20-10 split in terms of our evaluation criteria. Most of it is price and cost, but there is sort of deliverability factored in, project maturity and viability factored in, and as I mentioned, a huge emphasis on economic investments and job creation. So that's part and parcel. I think you saw it in our offshore wind RFP, most notably, where we've asked project to submit, a dedicated labor and workforce plan as part of their application, for example. So that's one small way that I think we can get at some of those, sort of the socioeconomic side of the energy infrastructure question.
Some of the other questions I'm getting, and I'm not gonna be as specific as these questions are. I'm gonna group them, but we're getting questions about sort of siting issues. All of these projects have to be built, whether they're transmission or from the perspective of procuring clean energy, the supply of clean energy, those projects have to be built, and they do run into sort of siting issues, as we've seen in Maine, and I think throughout New England. And so how are the states sort of dealing with, to the extent that you can talk about it, siting issues and in terms of, that creating, obviously you're not a siting board, so I'm not asking that, but in terms of how you're planning for the build out of transmission and clean energy, given that it's hard to build these projects and it takes a long time. And I'm going to actually start with Sheila and Barbara from the New England perspective, and then we'll come back to New York. If you can. If you can't, that's okay too. These are some general questions, I recognize.
Yeah, and at the highest level, I think some of it is really kind of coming down to more education and kind of we see customers getting more involved, right? They're more interested. They want to know more about it. They want to know what ISO New England is, which in some ways is kind of mind blowing because it's never been, right, a very public organization. So I think one of the things in the vision statement, at least that the states put out, was kind of increasing public engagement. So having, ISO just had its first open board meeting, and I know that they're not a siting authority, but kind of some of the analysis that they do plays into siting decisions. And so just kind of making that information more accessible, the process a little bit more approachable. Hopefully that can also help, because I think there's a real interest that we're seeing. So.
And Bobby, in your work, I know you spent a lot of time at the roundtable discussions. You're really active in some of the regional dialogue around the clean energy transition. Do you have any thoughts on sort of the siting challenge and how it plays into the clean energy transition that we all have to accomplish?
So to me, siting is very connected to environmental justice. And
Yeah.
I think that one of the issues, and we really have to deal with, is what is that link between transparency of process, environmental justice becomes a very tight link here. And our processes are very arcane, they're very complicated, and I'm not sure who's reading a newspaper anymore, but these requirements of, putting notices in newspapers and how much time and how and whether we devote resources to help people enter a siting process. Because I think that if we don't do that, and if the companies really don't get into grassroots community understanding in a way that we have never done it before, we are going to find siting these big transmission lines that and everything else that we're doing. Either it's going to delay or actually kill projects at the moment that we don't want them to. And this also brings up the issue of costs. And again, it's a public policy discussion that we really have not yet had, but that at some point we're going to have it, and it's very uncomfortable for us to do this. But we're just it's a bullet we're going to have to bite at some point, moving forward on all of this. And that to me is a lot of the essence of the energy transition, in a way that it was not like that before.
Yeah.
So again, I think it's as Jamie said, there's just a lot of issues where we have to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time, and address these policies. So I don't have an answer. I feel like I have a lot of sighting wounds on my back.
As many of us do.
Right. And we just, it's a very difficult, but we can't separate this issue out. And that's where this offshore wind, points of interconnection, all of those which look like technical issues, if you're going to build a big, collector station offshore, so we've told everybody in New England that the wind farms are way away from us. But guess what? There's might be a collector station in front of some place which they can see. Now, what impact is that going to have? Who's going to fight it? That's what makes Long Island and the Hamptons a fight that, Jamie is aware of, quite an interesting fight. Whereas it's so interesting on Cape Cod, the first wind farm is coming onto a beach like 3 miles from my house, and all the fighters of Cape Wind don't seem to understand that there's just going to be a little cable there. So just to let you know that these issues will not go away for a long time.
And Jamie, thanks, Bobby. Jamie, siting in New York, I mean, you've had luxury of actually having, like I said before, 2 transmission projects up and running, which is an achievement in and of itself, or at least under construction. How are you planning for the siting challenges, and how have you been able to expedite or smooth some of the siting challenges that are inherent to building out transition and these clean energy projects that are so needed to get to this transition, these goals?
Yeah, I think the challenges and really the frustrations with the length of time that siting had previously taken was the driving force behind that 2020 legislation that I mentioned led to the power grid study and everything. So the other big piece of that was it set up this brand new office in New York called the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, and it put in place this brand new regulatory regime for expedited siting of new renewable projects under Article 94C instead of the old Article 10, which was really designed for siting new power plant facilities, for example, in the 90s and 2000s. So there's that new process in place. I think the large majority of new renewable projects that we see coming into our contract, RFPs, are now going through the ORES process. And there are built-in incentives for, if you're a project on a landfill or a brownfield, for example, there are, statutory, much shortened timelines to actually get a completed application review, for example. So that's the one side. I think, states have to look at their siting regime holistically. For us, transmission does still lie in Article 7, which is its own sort of process. And one of our projects is fully permitted at the state level, the Chippy project. So that's going to be the soonest to come to fruition. And then the Clean Path project will need to go through its full Article 7 transmission permitting process, which it's now, feverishly doing. But the other side of what we've been working on at NYSERDA is the community engagement side. So we've got a whole clean energy siting team that's dedicated to being sort of the technical consultative resource for host communities or would-be host communities who, are often on the back foot when they get, 10 project applications. They don't know how to make heads and tails from a community solar project to an energy storage installation, for example. So, we have a great team that really is, they used to be racking up the miles, and now I think virtually, going community to community, talking them through their, zoning ordinances, their model solar, solar zoning laws, et cetera. So that's a fantastic way, and really I think is instrumental in getting communities comfortable with the role that they have to play as a host community.
All right. Well, this is, I'm going to sort of wrap it up because I know we've got to get people out on time. I want to respect their time. This has been a great discussion. Appreciate all of you, Bobby and Sheila and Jamie, for participating and for really helping us sort of get a better visual on how the other states have been tackling the challenge of, sort of implementing climate plans, transmission planning, getting projects up and running, and organizing it all, and obviously walking and chewing gum at the same time, because it does feel like that. With that, I think I'll hand it over to Marty. I want to say that we will share the slides that you all provided for your discussion today with our attendees. And Marty, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. Yes, and we'll also capture the questions. Thank you. There was excellent question and good back and forth. So thank you, Riley, from our staff. Thank you, Sarah, Barbara, Jamie, and Sheila. Really good discussion. I guess we got a few things to dig into here at E2 Tech. And thanks for our sponsors, Central Maine Power and Long Road. Couldn't make these programs possible without them. We do have a holiday party coming up. I know holidays are busy, but our party is more fun. And a legislative preview, Clean Energy Day. Jamie, I hope you come back and make an appearance. We would love to have you back. And as Shelby mentioned at the beginning, we will be doing a second in these forums. And this really seemed to be where a lot of the questions leaned towards about citing. It's a tough problem. That's really what that forum is going to be digging into. So we want to benefit from your thinking, E2 Tech members. And so with that, we thank you for your engagement here in the process. We hope you have a wonderful morning. Shoot me an email at marty@e2tech.org if there's anything that you need, and watch for the recording in the slides a little bit later today. Enjoy the rest of your morning. We will leave it there. Have a great day. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.